The version of God you get is the version of God you believe in. How does hearing that sentiment make you feel? I want you to really sit with that feeling as you continue to listen to this sermon. A common refrain among critics of the Bible is that the Old Testament God is scary and evil. As someone who was raised in a fire and brimstone kind of church, consequently embraced atheism, and has since freely and willingly circled back to Christianity, I deeply sympathize with this perspective of God, and I do understand where it comes from. So today I'll be sharing with you how I have made peace with the God depicted in the Old Testament, and how I explain the paradox of how the New Covenant is the Old Covenant. Both of these covenants are the same agreement with God, just presented differently between the Old and New Testaments. To start, consider that our very first encounter with the God of the Old Testament is in the very beginning in the Garden of Eden. This was a God who, as I illustrated in Sermon 6, originally created a deathless utopia for humanity to enjoy. We were given fruits and seed-bearing plants to eat, meaning nothing had to die in order for us to sustain our lives. Even the animals in the garden were herbivores. God made physical immortality easily accessible to Adam and Eve by way of the tree of life, which they were permitted to eat from. But due to their own projection of God as secretive and untrustworthy, they chose instead to eat from the forbidden tree. The forbidden tree was forbidden specifically to legitimize Adam and Eve's free will. It was not forbidden because God was hiding anything, but because God wanted Adam and Eve to experience eternal life, or physical immortality. So when they freely and willingly chose to eat from the forbidden tree, instead of from the tree of life, they voluntarily opted into a realm that featured death. That's this realm. So if we were to look at all the instances of God requesting sacrifices from humans throughout the Old Testament, as the totality of God's nature, we'd be ignoring the fact that God initially was the creator of a deathless world for humans. And God continues to inhabit that deathless dimension of reality while we navigate the land of the dead. The jump from God creating a deathless utopia in Genesis 2 to God demanding blood sacrifices in Genesis 4 does not make sense until you factor in our freedom of choice and perception. I am of the fervent belief that the version of God you get is the version of God you believe in. I believe that the way that God lovingly honors our free will is by letting us believe whatever we want about God and about reality. This means we only ever get from God what we are willing to get. So if you have doubts about God's generosity, you will perceive and experience God as withholding blessings from you, testing you, torturing you, forcing you to go through difficult things. If you have doubts about God's mercy, you will only perceive God as wrathful. This is illustrated quite clearly all throughout the Old Testament, starting with the story of Cain and Abel. Genesis 4. Adam made love to his wife Eve, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Cain. She said, "With the help of the Lord I have brought forth a man." Later she gave birth to his brother Abel. Now Abel kept flocks, and Cain worked the soil. In the course of time, Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord. And Abel also brought an offering, fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock. The Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering he did not look with favor. So Cain was very angry, and his face was downcast. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what's right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it." Now Cain said to his brother, Abel, "Let's go out to the field." And while they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Where is your brother Abel?" "I don't know," he replied. "Am I my brother's keeper?" The Lord said, "What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Now you are under a curse and driven from the ground, which opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it will no longer yield its crops for you. You will be a restless wanderer on the earth. What a striking implication that the earth opened up to receive Abel's blood from Cain's hand, as if Cain had made a sacrifice to the earth instead of making it to God. From this story, we learn that even though Cain had no animals to kill and offer to God, he was willing to kill a person as an offering to the earth, thus symbolically indicating his commitment to venturing even more deeply into the land of the dead, down and away from God, even further than his parents had fallen. Then he lied by omission, just like his parents did when God asked him what happened to Abel. And even before Cain murdered Abel, we can see hints about his true character in how he only gave some of the fruits of the soil to God. Some, right? There's nothing distinguishing about these fruits that he gave, whereas Abel took the fat from the firstborn of his flock, and he gave what was important and valuable in his mind. So God's judging these sacrifices not by what God thinks is valuable, but what we think is valuable, because God doesn't need anything from us. The I am of God is complete. It is us who live in the illusion of scarcity, which begets the illusion of material things having a value. It is us who believe only in what we see with our eyes, so by our own determination of what is valuable, we show God how much we value God. That is the real function of sacrifice. And when we cross-reference this passage in the Old Testament with Jesus' teachings in the New Testament, we see that God doesn't quantify what we give, rather he's looking at the heart of the giver. This principle of it's not what you give but how you give it is revealed in the parable of the talents, where a master gives different quantities of riches to his 3 servants, but even though this one servant had the smallest amount of talents given to him, he was still expected to do as much as he could with it in the master's absence. Instead, the servant revealed his disdain for the master and used that as an excuse not to do anything with what he had been given. This principle is also revealed in the story of the woman who gave her last coins at the temple. She didn't have much to give in terms of quantity, but Jesus was still impressed with the fact that she gave it because to her it was a lot. So now this brings us to our analysis of Abraham being called by God to sacrifice his firstborn son, Isaac. This story is a deep mystery, and it is often used to vilify God, but actually reveals the mechanism by which we can encounter God's goodness. So, Genesis 22, Abraham is tested. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. Then God said, "Take your son, your only son whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you." Early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." If Abraham thought Isaac was going to be killed, how could he say the word we? How could he say, "We will come back to you"? Meaning he and Isaac would return from the mountaintop after the sacrifice. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, "Father?" "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and wood are here," Isaac said, "but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the 2 of them went on together. Again, Abraham makes it clear that he doesn't believe Isaac is going to be sacrificed. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham!" "Here I am," he replied. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," he said. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." Abraham looked up, and there in the thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide." And to this day it is said, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time and said, "I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring, all nations on earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me." Do you see what happened here? Because Isaac was Abraham's first and only son at this point. This was the son God had promised to Abraham for 25 years. Abraham remained steadfastly faithful all that time. That is a long time to endure in your faith and trust in God. Okay? Abraham remained faithful that God would fulfill his promise to make Abraham a father of many nations. So when, after giving Isaac to Abraham, God said, "Sacrifice him to me," Abraham believed God would never go back on a promise. God promised Isaac to Abraham as the way that he would become the father of many nations. So because Abraham believed God was just, God was good, God was trustworthy, and God would provide the entire time, even up to the bitter end of going through the motions of going to sacrifice Isaac, Abraham never actually believed God would take Isaac away from him, because Isaac was the fulfillment of a promise, and God keeps his promises, and Abraham had faith in that fact about God. Abraham chose to believe in God's trustworthiness and reliability. Abraham chose to believe that this good and faithful God would never take his son away from him after promising that son to him. So even on the way to the mountain, he was still saying to his servants, "We will be back." And on the way up the mountain, he told Isaac, "God is going to provide a lamb for us to burn." Then all the way up to that final moment with his knife in the air, Abraham demonstrated his fervent belief that God would provide an animal to burn instead of Isaac. Lo and behold, God did provide a ram and let Isaac go. So hopefully you're starting to see what I mean when I say you get the God you believe in. We also see the whole you get the God you believe in mechanism at play in this exchange between Moses and God. The Lord said to Moses, "I have seen this people, and behold, they are an obstinate people. Now then, let me alone, that my anger may burn against them, and that I may destroy them, and I will make of you a great nation." Then Moses entreated the Lord, his God, and said, "O Lord, why does your anger burn against your people, whom you have brought from the land of Egypt with great power and with a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians speak, saying, 'With evil intent he brought them out to kill them in the mountains, and to destroy them from the face of the earth'? Turn from your burning anger and change your mind about doing harm to your people. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, your servants to whom you swore by yourself and said to them, 'I will multiply your descendants as the stars of the heavens, and call this land of which I have spoken, I will give to your descendants, and they shall inherit it forever.' So the Lord changed his mind about the harm which he said he would do to his people." This is a really controversial verse, by the way. It brings up questions of like, well, how can God be eternal and unchanging if he changed his mind, right? But again, I'm using this to support the premise that it's not God's nature that's changing. It's our projections onto God that change. And so it is our free choice to choose whether to have an enduring positive perception of God. Because if we can do that, that's what we'll get out of God, right? It is our choice to love God that allows us to access the loving nature of God. So Moses here demonstrates his unwavering faith in God's goodness by choosing to see the potential for God to act mercifully towards his people despite their sinfulness. There are nuances in the different translations, but regardless of which translation you're reading, it is clear that God was going to do something punitive, but then decided not to, because Moses interceded with reminders of God's original plan. It's not that God changed necessarily, but that in having enduring faith in the benevolent aspect of God, Moses was able to access the merciful aspect of God on behalf of his people. There are examples like this all throughout the Old Testament of God's nature being revealed in accordance with whatever biases the person already had about God. I might even argue that Jesus demonstrated the ultimate faithfulness in God's goodness by choosing to go through the entire crucifixion and remain dead for 3 days because his faith in God's ability to bring him back was so strong and unwavering that ended up being the case. As I said in my video essay, God the Great Hyperdimensional Mirror, God is a hyperdimensional mirror. God is a fractaline, kaleidoscopic, tesseractic, psychedelic, prismatic, interactive, hyperdimensional mirror. I say God in quotation marks because maybe God isn't literally a mirror, but God as a concept in the human mind functions like a mirror, reflecting back on itself in infinity, like a diamond bending light inside its many facets. By virtue of being beyond our comprehension, God acts like a screen upon which we project our own internal dramas and distortions. So if there's something we don't like about God, well, we can change our mind, which then changes our self, which then changes the reality we're experiencing. It's not that God needs us to love him or else. It isn't a threat. This isn't a hostage situation, unless, of course, you perceive it to be. Then congratulations, you've made yourself a hostage. Rather, it is the most fair and just setup I can think of. God is who God is, but God's I amness is never forced on you. No, you're free. You are free to wander all the way into the depths of hell because you believe God doesn't love you. You're free to turn towards God and say, show me what true love is. It is precisely by freely choosing to love God that we come to learn what love is. And by love, I mean assuming the best of God and having faith in God's mercy, God's goodness, and God's righteousness in all things. If you take on the attitude that God always intends well for you, that belief will be reflected back to you kaleidoscopically in every facet of your life. It's the difference between pronoia and paranoia. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the term, paranoia refers to the idea that you're being persecuted from all sides, that everyone's out to get you and hurt you. Whereas pronoia is the opposite. It's the assumption that every aspect of reality is conspiring in your favor. So basically, to be pronoid about God's nature is to activate your own ability to experience the goodness of God. If you take on the attitude that God is being unfair, well, you've set yourself up to experience exactly that. Unfairness, punishment, cosmic injustice. Only by freely choosing to love God do we get to viscerally, directly experience what love is. Freedom. Unless the choice to love is freely chosen, it cannot be called love.